you don't want to go out and say like, I want a programmer or I want a VA or whatever that role is. You want to go out and say, this is the end result that I'm trying to get. Then you work backwards, right? You're going to notice this theme of we always start with the end and we work backwards. So when you understand the end result you want to get, you're then able to work backwards and say, okay, well, what is required for this? What are some of the characteristics that a person needs to have? And then working all the way back to say, what for our company, what characteristics does this person have to be able to fit into our culture and to be able to work together?
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Outsourcing and Scaling Show. My guest today is Tom Sylvester. Tom, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, man. How about you?
Doing great. I'm excited to talk to you. I know you're a systems and process guy, which is what I'm all about. For those of you that don't know, Tom is the co-founder of Lifestyle Builder, a coaching and training company that helps entrepreneurs build their businesses to create more impact with their customers and get freedom in their lives. Over the past 15 years, Tom has helped with thousands of business leaders and helped their teams create more success through Fortune 500 companies all the way to startups. Tom, we're going to talk all about systems, all about processes. But first, let's take a gigantic step back. What were you like growing up? Did you know you wanted to be an entrepreneur? Were you a rebel? Were you a straight A student? And how did you get into being an entrepreneur?
Absolutely. So I think I always knew I was different. I always did really well in school, but I didn't really enjoy school. I didn't enjoy the way of learning. So I was always looking for, in school, they would call it cheating, but I was always looking for like the most creative way or the easiest way to get something done. And I think the turning point really, like I always had like side hustles, but the turning point came when I got to college and I took my first computer programming class, and the professor gave us an assignment. And everyone walked in with like sheets and sheets of paper. And I had one sheet of paper with like a couple lines on there. And I was like a self-taught programmer. So I was like, oh man, I'm going to get kicked out of here. They're going to see I'm a fraud. And so when the professor saw my paper, he pulled me up in the front of the room, had me share it. And I'm like, oh man, this is terrible. And he's like, Tom, you are lazy. And I'm like, oh, he's got me. And he's like, that's really good, because lazy people don't want to go the traditional path. They're looking at what's the least amount I can do to get the result. And he goes, that's what this is all about. And he goes, I know you're going to do well. And so when I look at it from an entrepreneur perspective, what I'm always looking for is whatever problems I see or are coming up, I'm like, how can we do that better? And how can we do that more efficiently?
So Tom, what was your first real entrepreneurial endeavor?
Yeah. So, I always had side hustles, and, in college, for example, I was buying used books at thrift stores and then selling them on Amazon. And this was back before we had smartphones. So I always had these things, but when I got out of college, basically I looked ahead and I said, I don't want to be sitting in a cubicle for the next 45 years. And so I tried a bunch of businesses, but my first real one was real estate investing. And, so I got into that, took a little bit to figure out. And then from there, we ended up building several other businesses, really beyond that.
So you're starting these different businesses. You obviously had to have systems and processes in order to do that, in order to be able to actually step away and start business number 2, business number 3. How did you go about creating those initial systems in order to be able to take a step back? Because I feel like that's where a lot of entrepreneurs struggle.
Yeah, absolutely. And so an interesting fact was I actually started 3 of our businesses while I still had a full-time job. And so what was unique and actually really good about that was it forced me to ask the question, what does this business need to look like to be able to run while I'm working? And a lot of people, when they dive full-time into entrepreneurship, they just automatically jump into every role and do all the work. And that's tough to then create systems because they put themselves in every role. What I had to do with each business was say, essentially the question I always ask is like, what needs to be true for this to work? And so I knew that I was going to be working a certain amount of time. So I had to design the business and understand what roles need to be in place, what things need to get done. And then I could intentionally design the business and put those pieces in place so that it could run mostly without me.
So you're almost saying that you architect the business up front to run without you instead of being involved and then trying to bring yourself out.
Absolutely. Stephen Covey, start with the end in mind. It's one of the best quotes, and it's something that we always do. So when you understand what it needs to look like, so for example, when we work with a lot of entrepreneurs, we'll first help them figure out what they want their life to look like. And then part of that is saying, okay, based on your life looking this way, what sort of business or what sort of business model will help you get there? And then what does that business need to look like? So what we can then do is, to your point, architect a business. And then we say, okay, so we're at starting point A. This is where we want to be. So then we build a roadmap there. And what happens with a lot of entrepreneurs is you might initially play all the roles, but by thinking about what it needs to look like, you can consistently then say, okay, what do I have to get off of my plate in order to get closer and closer to that? So by being really intentional about that, you're not diving in, then trying to figure it out. You've got a plan laid out and you're then adjusting along the way.
So taking stuff off your plate, there's two ways to do that. You got the automation, you got the hiring. Talk to us a little bit about your mindset going into each.
Yeah. So actually, before the automating and the hiring, the first thing we always look at is what can you eliminate? So every process, every system can follow this simple format, which is there's a trigger, something that starts and kicks off this process. There's then an end, which basically says this process is complete and we can do something else. And then there's 3 to 5 major steps that happen in between. So if you're thinking about it, you want to say, okay, for any process I have, what is the trigger? What are the 3 to 5 major steps? And what's the end result? Once you get that documented, you can then break those major steps into sub steps. And then before you automate or delegate anything, what you want to go through is each of those steps and say, if I remove this step, will that prevent me from getting the end result? And if the answer is no, you want to remove that. So it's kind of like, have you heard of Marie Kondo with her like spark joy and all of that?
No, I haven't. Can you tell the audience more about it?
Absolutely. So basically, she's got a Netflix documentary. She's got a couple of books, and she's all about like decluttering your house. Okay. And what she basically looks at is, is this like really contributing to you? And if it's not, you can remove it, and it's actually going to free up and make your life happier. Same thing with systems and businesses. If you have too much stuff in your process, the things that aren't really adding value are going to clutter all the stuff that does add value. So your ultimate goal is to strip away everything that's not value added, which is really a waste. And then with what's left, now you can say, okay, which one of these tasks is really good for a computer to do? These are things that are repetitive. They don't require a lot of thought. And, you want the same thing happening every time. So then when you automate those tasks, what's left over is stuff that usually computers aren't really good at and humans actually enjoy because it forces us to think and be creative, not just like sit and hit the same button over and over again.
I think that scares a lot of people because whenever you have so much stuff going on in your business, you just start eliminating things. You start to think, how does that affect the big picture? How do you actually figure out what is important and what's not?
Yeah, a big part of this is you do it incrementally. So whenever someone's trying to implement a system or put a process in place, they'll often get overwhelmed and they feel like they've got to do everything at once. And they're so busy now that they don't have time to do it. So one of the first things we always recommend to people is that every single week, you should be having a weekly meeting. And what you do in this weekly meeting is the first part is you reflect. So what wins did I have this last week? Let's acknowledge what's going well. And then let's also identify what challenges exist because those challenges we want to be solving going forward. So by doing that, you can then take like the top challenge, the biggest headache that you've had. And in the upcoming week, you just put a process in place or you adjust a process to either reduce or get rid of that issue. So by doing this, a couple things happen. One, you're able to consistently make improvements that get rid of the biggest headache you had the previous week. And second, it's not you having to do it all at once and not being overwhelmed or scared of having to put processes in place.
That makes a lot of sense. You talk about automation. I think that's another area that scares people. People that either don't know how to code, they work with developers, they've had issues. Are you talking about using stuff like Zapier? Or are you talking about building your own software? Or is it a combination of both? And how does someone who's not familiar with that space really get started automating parts of their business?
Absolutely. Yeah. So my background's in computer science, so I definitely am a programmer. I understand all of that. But really what's beautiful about like this day and age is that you don't have to know how to code to make just about anything. Even when we're working with like startup companies that are creating apps and stuff like that, the first version of their apps often have no custom coding. They're just using different services that are out there and we're piecing them together. So you mentioned something like Zapier. What Zapier does actually, when I talked about the process earlier with a trigger and then a set of steps and end result, Zapier is set up the same way. So when you map out what your process looks like, you can use something like Zapier to say, when this thing happens, then do this thing, then do this thing, then we're done. So for most people, you should never have to custom code or do anything like that. Now, as you grow your business, and if you have very specific things, it might get to a point where you want to hire somebody for that. But there are so many out of the box solutions and so many great pieces of software out there that it doesn't take a lot. And if it does, usually what you're just trying to do is to have somebody integrate two pieces of software rather than creating something from scratch.
So let's talk about hiring. This is the outsourcing and scaling show. What about the process before hiring? What do you need in place before you hire someone for your business?
Absolutely. So there's really a couple things. The first thing is you want to have an understanding of what the end result is that you're trying to hire for. So, I'll give an example. Like people come to me and say, "Hey, Tom, I want to coach." And I'm like, well, no, you don't want to coach. What is it you think a coach is going to get you? And then they tell the real problem. And that's what you're trying to solve. So you don't want to go out and say like, I want a programmer or I want a VA or whatever that role is. You want to go out and say, this is the end result that I'm trying to get. Then you work backwards, right? You're going to notice this theme of we always start with the end and we work backwards. So when you understand the end result you want to get, you're then able to work backwards and say, okay, well, what is required for this? What are some of the characteristics that a person needs to have? And then working all the way back to say, for our company, what characteristics does this person have to be able to fit into our culture and to be able to work together? Because a lot of people first focus on skills when hiring. The first thing you want to be able to focus on is, are we a good fit and can we work together? Because you can have the best person in the world, and if you can't work with them or if they can't work with your team, everything else is going to struggle. So whenever I'm interviewing someone, there's always two questions that I ask. And the majority of the time, this will help me figure out if I'm going to hire them or not. The first question is, tell me your story. And this does a couple of things. I can see, where do they start? What do they think is important? How well do they communicate? Are they, long-winded? Are they just giving me little tidbits, or are they really, well with that? So you're going to get a lot in between the lines from that question. And then the second question I always ask is, okay, so why are we here today? And amazingly enough, people are usually very honest with that. And so usually from those two questions, I'll know, is this somebody that's going to be a good fit for the role and for our company? Or is this somebody that maybe their intentions aren't aligned or they're not really a great communicator? So we're going to struggle to be able to incorporate them in, especially if this is somebody that's in like a remote position.
I love that second question. Why are you here today? Because I can definitely see people saying, oh, because I need money, because I need to pay a bill, or something outside of what you want to hear there. Talk a little bit about after the hire. So you've identified what kind of person you want to look for. You've interviewed, you found a good fit. I know you mentioned having those weekly meetings. What else do you do to set expectations and to make sure that people are meeting those expectations ongoing?
Yeah, I love the fact that you just said that word, expectations. This is the most important thing that so few people do. And when you're setting expectations, basically it looks like this. Hey, Nathan, here are my expectations for the role. Here's the desired outcome. Here's, how I need you to show up and function, whatever that is. And here's the piece that most people miss. You then want to turn it around and say, what are your expectations of me? Now that I laid out what the desired results are, what do you need from me in order to be successful in this role? And this does a couple things. One, right away, you now know how you need to support that person, because what you're going to find is that different people, based on their personality types, based on their skill sets, are going to need different types and different levels of support. So you instantly now hear from them what they need in order to succeed. The second thing is you see if your expectations are aligned or not, because far too often what happens is that we both say, hey, so we're in agreement, right? And you say, yeah. And I say, yeah. And then time goes by and you're not hitting my expectations, but you don't realize it. You think you are. And I don't know how to bring it up because I didn't really set them right at the beginning. So it's very challenging. So when you set expectations that way, right away, if there's a disconnect, you address it. And it's not really awkward because nothing has happened yet. Then what you do is you set that consistency cadence of following up. So here's the expectation. Here's what we're looking for to happen by when, and here's how we're going to follow up. And if expectations are off either way, here's how we're going to address them. So basically what you're doing is you're giving each other permission to talk about, hey, we're missing expectations and let's get back on track. Then when that happens, it's like, hey, Nathan, when we talked last week, you said that this thing was going to happen. And what I'm seeing is that it's not happening. And what you want to do is you want to raise it up, but you don't want to assume like why that person's doing it. What you want to ask is like, what's going on? What support do you need in order to hit that expectation that we agreed on? So by doing that, a couple things happen. It's very easy for you to bring it up. And when you do bring it up, you're bringing it up from the point of, hey, we both want to win. How can I help you win? Rather than like, hey, Nathan, you didn't do your job. Like, you're fired.
Right. No, that makes a ton of sense. So I always say that there's three different levels of people you can hire. You can hire the followers, think more of that virtual assistant for your processes. You can hire the doers, let's say the specialists, the graphic designers, the writers, or you can hire the experts, the high-level freelancers, the agencies, the people that bring their own strategy to the table. Are you mostly teaching people how to hire the followers? Is it all three levels? And how does your process change depending on what type of person you're trying to hire?
Yeah, it's really all three levels. And what I find is that at different points in business, you're going to hire different levels. So it always comes back to your strategy and what you're trying to achieve. So in some cases, especially early on, you might just be hiring someone for a specific project. So the scope of that is really then that project, and the fitting into your company and some of that may not be as critical. But if you're now looking to grow your team and you're looking to hire somebody in on multiple projects or more permanently, now it's a lot more critical to make sure that they're going to be a good fit for your team. So it really comes back to, once again, what are you trying to achieve? And then what makes the most sense? And a lot of people will often, try to go very cheap on things, where what they don't realize is that, sure, you can, like, on paper, spending less money sounds good. But if you're going to have delays in communication or the results, if that's going to pull you away from your higher value activities, even though the $3 or $5 or whatever it is sounds really good, it's actually going to cost you a lot more, because your time is more valuable in most cases than any money you're going to pay. So what you really want to figure out is, what is the right level for you to be able to pay that's going to allow you to hire the right level of talent. And a lot of people, what I find, go too cheap and end up spending more of their time and get really frustrated with delegating and hiring somebody.
And you mentioned this before the show, that a lot of times people feel like when they're hiring people, it's actually adding more work to their plate instead of what it should be doing and freeing up their time. Besides just making sure you're paying the right amount, what else can you do to ensure that that actually does free up your time long term?
Yeah, one of the biggest things is, like we talked about earlier, you want to really talk about what the outcome is and not what the tasks are that somebody's going to do. Because in most cases, you're hiring somebody that should be bringing some skills to the table. And so by talking about, here's the desired result, you can then work with that person to say, here's the framework, or here's how we're going to think and how we're going to work together. So what a lot of people do that end up getting burnt out with hiring team members or fear it is they tell their team member what to do. So for example, go edit this podcast and do this thing and do this thing. So the team member goes and does that. They run into an issue, and now they haven't been taught how to think or what decisions they can make versus what they got to come back with. So now they're coming back and asking me a question, pulling me away from something else. And it just gets frustrating, because it's like, this is taking me way more time and I'm better off doing it myself. So what you want to be doing is set the outcome, but then talk through the decision-making framework and what decisions that person can make on their own and which ones they should come back and check with you on. And if this makes people nervous because they feel like they're getting rid of control, all you're going to do is just put checkpoints in along the way before something moves from one step to another. So for example, let's say somebody is editing a podcast and they're nervous that somebody else is going to edit it wrong or do whatever else. So you have that person do the task, and then there's just a checkpoint before it moves on to the next step where you can go in, confirm it's up to your standards, and then you allow it to move on. So whatever it is that's kind of holding people back or causing them to not want to give up control, you just got to look at, okay, what is the thing that I need to see in order to allow this to happen? And then just set that into the process.
I love it. I think that's great. And really figuring out with people what decisions they can make and which ones they should escalate to you, I think is a huge part of saving your time. What else that we didn't talk about so far are mistakes that you commonly see from your clients when it comes to hiring, scaling, and automating their business?
Yeah, one of the biggest things is, and it's a challenge, is managing your business today while also planning for the future. Because a lot of, especially like a lot of entrepreneurs, we're kind of flying by the seat of our pants. We really don't have a lot of planning in place. And because I initially came from like the corporate consulting world, I was spending a lot of time doing strategy with leaders. So we were planning out, what do we got to do now? But what does also, 6 months, 9 months, a year, 3 years, 5 years look like? So for most entrepreneurs, where they would benefit is making sure that you have a longer term vision. You've got a short term focus, like for example, 90 days, and you're constantly checking in and readjusting. Because when you do that, you're making sure that you're handling what you need to do today. But because 6 months out, you might need a certain position or you might have a certain project coming up, you can now start doing some of the work so that by the time that comes, it's not a surprise while also managing your day to day. So it is a little bit of a balancing act, especially as you're growing. But the more time you can spend planning and strategizing, the more prepared you're going to be, not only to understand what's coming up, but when things change, to be able to adjust along the way. Because most people aren't um, being proactive when it comes to planning this stuff and then having the right system in place to be able to quickly shift when other things come up.
Interesting. Yeah, I could see a lot of entrepreneurs struggling with that big picture. You have multiple businesses now. You use a lot of freelancers. Can you walk people through what your normal week looks like in terms of managing, meeting, setting expectations, give people a sense for how it can be done at a high level?
Absolutely. So basically, we implement this cadence that really works well. And it basically comes down to there's a daily meeting that's 15 minutes or less. And so each member of our team is spending a little bit of time really getting clear on what did I accomplish yesterday? What am I planning to accomplish today? What's the intention? And then what's in my way or what support do I need? So with each person doing that, we then have a quick call. Well, depending on the business, it could either be a quick call that's 15 minutes or less where each person's sharing that, or it could be done something like Slack where everyone's able to share that because time zones might be different. What this allows everyone to do is you're spending a couple of minutes to get clear on what you're going to do that day, as well as you understand what everyone else is working on. So if two people are working on the same thing, you instantly know that. If somebody needs something from somebody else, you instantly know that, and you can then coordinate on how to do it. So that avoids a lot of email, a lot of time delays because someone's waiting on a decision from someone else or someone has a problem, they don't know how to solve it. So that's the daily meeting. Then really the weekly meeting is the key beyond that because every week we're going to have the team check in. The intention was to get this stuff done this week. What went well, what didn't go well, and let's look at our scorecard. Let's look at the key areas of the business, a couple of key numbers that are going to tell us how things are going. Based on that, we'll then set the intention for the next week and understand what each person needs to do so that we're all coordinated. So the combination of those two meetings allow us to know what we're doing week by week and then daily to check in on the execution of that. Beyond that, we'll then have more strategic meetings, like a monthly meeting to check in on budgets and all of that, a quarterly meeting to check in on goals. But it's really that cadence of strategic planning so you know where you're going, but then that daily and weekly execution so you make sure everyone is doing what they need to move towards that. And really your job as then the leader and the founder becomes supporting the team and basically saying, I want to get out of your way, but what support do you guys need to do to be able to get everything done?
I love it. What tools are you using? Can you give people a list of some common stuff? I know we mentioned Zapier, you mentioned Slack. What other ones do you use?
Yeah, Google Suite is one of our huge tools. So that's able to cloud storage. We can collaborate on documents. Zoom is a really good tool. We use that for a lot of our coaching calls and team calls. Slack is another great one. So Slack will often replace email for internal team communication. And I think those are the major ones. Zapier is a really good one for automation. It's going to help connect different pieces and different tools together. Um, those are probably the core ones. And what I find is just about every business we work with ends up putting those tools in place. Another tool, I guess, is everyone needs some sort of a project management tool. And so depending on how your business is running, Trello is really good for more of like a Scrum or Kanban system where you're kind of prioritizing work, taking one thing and doing it. Asana is really good for more of a traditional project management where you're planning out projects and assigning them to people. So those are probably the core tools that I see most businesses using to help manage the team and improve communication.
Tom, I love it. We're getting close to wrapping up here. What else did I miss? What other common things do you help businesses with, or do you see mistakes that business owners are making?
I think one of the biggest mistakes business owners make is that they focus too much on the business and not enough on themselves. And this could come in not taking care of themselves. Your health, mental and physical, is a big part of being able to show up for not only your business, but your family and other people that are important in your life. Not knowing how the business not only supports your customers, but supports you. Because a lot of times what we see happen with entrepreneurs is that they essentially prioritize the business ahead of their life. And that can lead to some really bad consequences. I mean, we're talking divorce, we're talking people regretting missing out on key moments of their life. So one of the biggest things that we do with entrepreneurs, one of the first things we do is have them track their time for a week and see just where all their time's going. And then we have them align that back to what their personal goals and what their business goals are. And basically what we're looking for is there congruency here? Are you able to live the lifestyle that you want? And are you able to achieve your business goals? And if there's a disconnect there, now we can start to say, okay, what things should really be on your plate and you be doing, and what shouldn't be on your plate? And then all those things that shouldn't be on your plate then go into, okay, what can we cut? What can we automate and what can we delegate? And that then helps us work towards figuring out what tools do we need, what people do we need, and ultimately allowing that entrepreneur to not only have success in the business, but really allow that success to drive that lifestyle that they're looking for, rather than all the negative things that could come up if they're neglecting their life just focused on the business.
Tom, I love it. This has been great. Where can people find out more about you, and what are you most excited about for the rest of the year?
Absolutely. So our main website is tomandariana.com. You can hear everything we have going on, our podcast, our book, our programs, everything else. What we're really excited about is actually our first book is being released this year. It's called Lifestyle Builders, Build Your Business, Quit Your Job, and Live Your Ideal Lifestyle. And essentially, this is the process that we take entrepreneurs through. And, just really quick, it's figuring out what you want out of your life, getting your personal finances in order, validating your business idea, then putting the right systems and processes in place to help it scale. We show people how to then transition from being an employee to an entrepreneur, and then ultimately use all of that to live your ideal lifestyle now, rather than having to wait 45 years until retirement and then hope you can do it.
I love it. Thanks so much for joining us, guys. Check out Tom's book, check out his podcast, and I'm sure we'll be in talk soon.
Absolutely. Thank you.